Print, email, Facebook, Twitter. More analysis. The China-Australia relationship is strained, but not broken. Australia's relationship with China is not in crisis, but no one would blame you for thinking that it is. After all, there's been plenty of turbulence this week. Look at the treatment meted out to the Foreign Minister Julie Bishop after she met her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Argentina on Tuesday. Ms. Bishop had been trumpeting the meeting for days as she dismissed a crescendo of bad news about frayed ties with our largest trading partner, and the foreign minister painted a rosy picture of the tete-a-tete in its aftermath, telling the ABC it had been warm, candid and constructive. But there wasn't a flicker of warmth in Beijing's account of the meeting. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs made it clear that Wang Yi was not happy with Australia. In fact, he was so unhappy that he delivered a brief lecture to Ms. Bishop about our shortcomings. The China-Australia relationship had encountered difficulties in recent months, said Wang Yi. The source of blame though was clear. It was due to the Australian side. Beijing takes Australia to task. It's not hard to guess what he's talking about. Beijing has been angered by the government's legislation to crack down on foreign interference, legislation which is largely aimed at China's increasingly sophisticated attempts to flex its muscles within Australia's borders. There are also long-standing tensions over Australia's stance on Beijing's militarization of the South China Sea, as well as Canberra's attempts to hedge against China's meteoric rise in our region. But Wang Yi had a solution. Australia must break away from traditional thinking, he said, take off their colored glasses, and look at China's development from a positive angle, and provide more for the cooperation between the two countries, instead of showing reluctance. Rather predictably, the nationalistic Chinese tabloid The Global Times was quick to up the ante. The tabloid mused about a range of punishments which could be inflicted on Australia, each more horrible than the last. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is due to visit China later this year, but the trip will not be necessary, the paper declared blithely. He could visit a few years later. China could also cut off trade with Australia, perhaps by freezing imports of wine and beef. Lowering Aussie exports by $6.45 billion would send cold chills up and down the spine of Australia, the editorial said. Of course, it would be an even greater shock if the import reductions totaled $10 billion. China has been very friendly toward Australia, but their arrogant attitudes in return over the past 2 years have become a virtual example of what it means to bite the hand that feeds. Time to panic. Not really. Of course, if China really wanted to use economic coercion, then it could inflict massive pain on Australia. Restricting the flow of Australian iron ore to China, or the stream of Chinese tourists and students to Australia, would have enormous ramifications. But Beijing has taken none of these steps, and there's no concrete evidence it's seriously contemplating them. So far the signs of displeasure, a go slow on diplomatic exchanges, public scoldings, are largely symbolic. And while the Global Times is a state-owned newspaper, it's best to think of it as a weapon, not a window into the deliberations of China's top leaders. Fergus Ryan from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says the Chinese government uses the Times to create uncertainty and shape behavior in English-speaking countries. It's helpful for Beijing to have those messages out there, because it causes stakeholders in Australia, particularly businesses that trade with China, to worry about the relationship with China, Mr. Ryan said. That puts more pressure on the government to accede to Beijing's demands. And by creating a sense of crisis around the relationship, Beijing hopes it can draw vivid red lines in the sand, making it amply clear that any further transgressions from Australia could have terrible consequences. Threats are cheap to make, but they can shape behavior effectively. As Fergus Ryan puts it, if they can get the message across in this way, then perhaps they won't have to resort to pulling those levers. Still, calling a bluff isn't always easy, and despite the Prime Minister's bland assurance Wednesday morning that we have a good, frank relationship with China, the reality is our leaders are facing rapidly sharpening choices. Polly's spy chief sound the alarm. 2 recent speeches to Parliament, one explosive, the other humdrum, capture the conundrum neatly. When Andrew Hastie got to his feet in the Federation Chamber on Wednesday evening, he didn't mince his words. The chair of the powerful Intelligence and Security Committee laid out a truth which is universally acknowledged, but rarely voiced. In Canberra, we live in a rapidly changing world. We are watching the rise of authoritarian states. Those states are conducting foreign interference operations across Western democracies. In Australia, it is clear that the Chinese Communist Party is working to covertly interfere with our media, our universities, and also influence our political processes and public debates. Australia's spy and police chiefs hint at this all the time. But they are always very careful never to mention the CCP by name in public. You can see why. It's an unpalatable reality. Our largest trading partner, and a nation destined to be the regional superpower, is run by a totalitarian regime which has been actively undermining some of the pillars of Australian democracy. The other speech generated fewer headlines, but it's still worth noting. Steve Martin isn't the most influential player in Canberra. But the former mayor of Devonport turned senator has his nose close to the ground in his home state of Tasmania, and he used his first speech to the Senate to deliver a stark warning. As our economic reliance on China grows, Australia simply doesn't have the luxury of angering it. As China is the biggest overseas market for Tasmanian exports and biggest source of overseas tourism, investment and international students, our economic prospects as a state and a nation are today tied to China, whether we like it or not, he told the Senate. Diplomatic cocktail parties in Canberra must feel a long way removed from a mine at Savage River, an arts space in Hobart, a farm in Sprayton or a vineyard in the Tamar Valley. But it is these places which feel the pain if relations go bad, and we simply cannot afford it. Print, email, Facebook, Twitter.